Welcome to Why Do I Keep Doing That? This podcast is for smart, capable people who are tired of repeating patterns they've already outgrown. I'm Brenda Florida, certified life coach, and if you've ever walked away from a conversation, a decision, or a relationship thinking, why did I just do that again? You are in the right place. You're not stuck, you're patterned. And patterns can be interrupted. In each episode, I'm going to break down why you keep doing what you do, where it started, and how to shift it so you can stop reacting and start leading in your own life. I'm so glad you're here. Have you ever walked away from a conversation or a situation and thought, why did I just do that? Maybe you said yes when you meant no. You set yourself up for giving too much or taking on too much responsibility or a project you don't have the bandwidth for. Maybe you explained yourself a little too much. Instead of just saying no, it's no, I can't because blah, 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 to convince the other person that it's okay that you've said no. Maybe you overreacted to something. Maybe you got really triggered and just gave off a level 9 response to a level 2 event. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you underreacted. Your feelings were really hurt. You felt really intimidated or pressured by somebody. Instead of saying, hey, time out, I need a minute here, you just shut down and maybe even smiled to get through it. All of these things are why I created this podcast. And it's because I have done them all too, I'm no different than you are. I've just been working on this for a really long time. And so I created this podcast so week by week I could share stories that you'll be able to relate to from my own life or various clients that I've coached. And we can have this conversation around the fact that these are caused from patterns, not because something's wrong with you, you're too, label it, whatever you want to say, insecure, not assertive enough, or you're too aggressive, or you're whatever. Let's take off the labels for all of that and realize that the truth is how we're responding day after day, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, is primarily defined by a pattern, which is just, a repeated behavior that often goes into action before we've even considered whether or not that's how we want to respond. So let's talk for a second about the subconscious mind versus the conscious mind. So science tells us that we have 90 to 95% of what we are thinking and doing that is coming from our subconscious. Only 5 to 10% that is coming from the conscious mind. So a lot of that, think about parts of your body, right? You don't have to consciously decide for your heart to beat or to breathe or, all these things that are these systems in our body that are just working. So that's awesome. Totally great. Leave all that stuff in the subconscious. Okay. But there's all kinds of other things in our subconscious that are caused from traumatic events when we were children, and all kinds of other events that shaped how we engaged with our environment as children. So when I say traumatic event, a lot of you may be thinking, oh no, I don't have one. I wasn't abused. I wasn't, whatever, kidnapped. I wasn't, I didn't have any of these traumatic experiences. But it doesn't take what we intellectually think of as trauma to create a pattern. It can just be a great disappointment that you had. It could be a teacher that made you feel really bad about yourself because, they asked you to read out loud in class and you stumbled on some words and maybe some kids laughed at you. The teacher might have been fine, but the kids laughing at you did it. There's all kinds of these situations that happen to us as children that we don't have the skills to cope with and sort through the way we would today. And so we start building coping devices. Okay, I'm not going to read out loud anymore. I'm going to sit in the back of the room and hope the teacher doesn't call on me. I'm going to, all these things. So this event that scared me, made me nervous, made me uncomfortable, made me sad, made me angry, made me whatever, doesn't happen again. It all comes from this protective place in our psyche from a time when we were way too little to have our own resources that built itself up to be protective. And I think that's important because it's good to know that these things that may be tripping us up and causing a lot of problems today in our adult life did actually start from a benevolent place. So I can come to my own pattern with compassion instead of being mad at it or critical at it. Okay. So the pattern is anything that you're repeating probably from your subconscious and it isn't working, but you keep doing it anyway. And it's not because you're weak. It's not because something's wrong with you. It is because at one time that kept you safe. It started as protection. Seeking approval kept you safe, maybe made you feel loved, right? If they agree with me, if they approve of me, for all of you who are performers, like I love to perform. I love to sing. I used to sing a lot when I was younger. Even being on this podcast with you in a way is performing, right? So a lot of times those of us who like to perform, like to be the center of attention or the class clown and all those sorts of archetypes we can think of, we love that approval. We love that applause because it makes us feel safe or it makes us feel loved or it makes us feel the attention that we need to feel like we are lovable. Okay. It's not just always ego or what people think of ego building towards arrogance. It's that it actually makes me feel like a valued and valuable, loved and lovable human being. Okay. And all of that is part of a sense of safety. We learn to overwork to earn love, right? Like perfectionism and working hard are always usually very tied together. And so in my case, being a woman, I wanted to be a good girl. I was also raised in very conservative, evangelical, Christian, religious churches and culture in my family and all of that. And so there was a lot of emphasis on, the only way to be good is to be a good girl. Even then, you're still a sinner. That's a whole nother podcast episode right there. But, so a lot of religious things are playing into this besides our own culture that we live in. If you're living in the United States or wherever you're living, this is the place I have lived my whole life in the US. And so that is the culture I am most familiar with. But every culture has its things. And that impacts us. It impacts our ability to feel safe emotionally and or physically. And so we do these things, we start these patterns to create safety, to create a sense of earning love or being able to be lovable or thinking we have value or getting validation from people, things, situations, and people outside of ourselves. We might be overthinking to prevent criticism. We might be doing all kinds of keeping the peace type, you know, activities like in our family if we had an argumentative family or a member of our family, probably a caretaker, but it could be a sibling who's having a lot of emotional struggles. Then like in my case, my mother was not very emotionally equipped for plenty of good reasons, coming out of her childhood, but she was not terribly emotionally equipped for motherhood. And so it was very stressful for her. And so I took on the job very early in my life, way before I could think about it consciously or even understand what was happening, where I knew it was my job to help keep her happy. Make mom happy. Don't be any trouble. Don't get in trouble. Don't be needy. Don't need her to do things for you. And so I got hyper independent. I got very tuned into her moods and her needs so I could meet them hopefully before, she had a meltdown or whatever. And all of that translates into patterns I repeated as an adult. So I married a man who wanted to be taken care of a lot, who wanted to underfunction, no problem, because I overfunction. That's what I'm built for. It may feel authentic to you. It certainly felt authentic to me. It's not so much authentic for who you truly are. It is a pattern that you have repeated so many times, it feels like who you are. But in my core, I am not made, you are not made, we are not made to be dysfunctional. We're, the dysfunctional expression of a fabulous quality is not what we're going for here. We want the expression of it that is not dysfunctional. So I am a very helpful person. I have great intuition. I am a hard worker, all those things. I just have to make sure I don't overexpress them and get into the dysfunctional side of it. So one of the key concepts here that you're going to hear run throughout episodes is that what protected us when we were little, 3 years old, 5 years old, 12 years old, whatever it is, whatever age we were, is now exhausting in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way. What worked then does not work now. It's draining your time, it's draining your energy, it's draining your money, it's draining relationships, your ability to lead, whether you're, to be the leader in your own life, which we're each one called to be, or you have leadership roles outside, of your own personal life where you are a leader maybe in your family or a leader in the workplace or you own your own business or something like that. Leadership, can happen in different realms of our life. And these patterns can rob us of our ability to function from that truest part of ourselves that is able to be a leader, that can validate ourselves, that can give ourselves self-love, self-protection, self-safety, that is a healthy expression of that instead of a dysfunctional or distorted reaction, which is what is in the pattern. Okay. So I want to give you, because I always like to be practical. I like these big concepts. We will talk to some degree every episode about the patterns and how they're affecting us in very specific ways. In this first episode, I wanted to just give you an overview of the concept. And I love talking about these big things. And they build self-awareness, and that's great. And self-awareness is only the very first step. Self-awareness is not enough to break a pattern. Okay. So if you're thinking, again, why do I keep doing that? Or maybe it's something you want to stop. I have so many clients are like, I know what gives me my best day. If I get up and do a little journaling, have my coffee, maybe work out. Everybody's pattern's a little different, but whatever, do these things. My day is always better. And yet I'm not doing it. I'm staying up too late the night before, or maybe I'm drinking too much, or, whatever, partying too much, or staying on my phone too long, scrolling social media. And then I'm too tired to get up early enough to work out or journal or whatever. And I rush into the office or into my computer and start working or whatever. So I know this isn't working for me. And yet I can't seem to stop doing the self-sabotaging behaviors. The other side of the same coin here. Okay. So whether you feel like it's something you're doing over and over again that isn't serving you, dating the wrong people, being in relationships with the wrong people, including work relationships, whatever it is that isn't serving you anymore. It might be something that feels more like something you want to stop. Stopping it would benefit you, but you still keep doing it. All the same thing. They're patterns. That's what's at the core of it. So we can do all the time management we want, or positive thinking about working out, or, how we're going to stop losing our temper when this happens or whatever. And we can have our mantras and, all the things. And it won't matter because all we have is awareness. And where we have to get to is the pattern. What is that pattern? What am I trying to accomplish? Maybe I'm trying to prevent something, or maybe I'm trying to get something. I'm trying to get love and approval or validation, or I'm trying to prevent people from being mad at me, whatever it is. And then what is that pattern costing me? Sometimes it will still serve you, or at least momentarily serve you. But in the big picture, it isn't. Not setting the boundaries is exhausting you. You may feel like it makes things easier because your relationships are easier. There's less disharmony. You may be a lover of harmony, as many people are, especially women. And so it seems like, oh, all this harmony keeps my life from being so stressful. But you're not taking into account the stress that is created and the cost that your body is paying for not being in your own truth. So I want you just to sort of let that settle in. Awareness is always the first step, and that's great. And if you're on this podcast listening to this, you probably have a certain amount of self-awareness about this issue. You may not be able to clearly name the pattern or quite connect the dots, but there's obviously something that resonates with you about this sentence. Why do I keep doing that? So you have a certain amount of self-awareness. You may have a lot of self-awareness. You may have had therapy for this, coaching for this, read tons of books about it, and you're still doing it, or you're still not able to stop doing it, whatever. That is because we've got to go into the pattern. We've got to interrupt the pattern in order to then find our way out. And so that is the real key. That is why I have this very powerful session that I call the way out, because that is where we go into your specific situation, your unique life, the interruption tools that will work best for you, because everybody's not the same. And then once we've interrupted it, how do we start to create something that is a different response from the pattern? So that way out session is incredibly powerful. If you're interested in that, just go to the show notes. There's a link there. Until then, I want to leave you with this tool of just starting to think. One, just start thinking about it as a pattern instead of a flaw about yourself. This is something you do wrong. This is something you're not good at. This is, I'm not good at speaking up for myself. I'm not good at speaking up in a meeting, or, whatever specific thing. I'm not good at setting boundaries or saying no. Instead of criticizing ourselves with that, let's just do this one simple thing this week. When that comes into your awareness, just meet yourself with compassion and say, oh, that's a pattern. That's just my pattern. It's like, those are just my socks. And maybe I've been wearing red socks my whole life, and I kind of think that's my only choice, but it's not. Socks come in all different colors, and I actually could learn to choose a different sock, to feel comfortable in a different sock, to like a different sock. But judging it criticizing yourself is not going to help you. You will never hear me say to break this pattern, to interrupt this pattern, you just need to be more disciplined, or you just need to be harder on yourself, or, get more willpower, work harder. Never, because none of those qualities actually help interrupt a pattern. Self-love helps interrupt a pattern. Self-compassion helps interrupt a pattern. And then those help you, once you interrupt through that energy, then finding this new way to respond, a new choice for what am I going to do then in this scenario that triggers my pattern? What do I want to do differently next time? All of that is going to come out of self-love and self-compassion, not out of criticism, not out of willpower. And that's probably why many things that you might have tried in the past don't work. But that is not my jam. That is not where I'm coming from. So you will never hear me say any of those things. There's nothing wrong with you. You have patterns. We all have patterns. And we need to learn to look below the surface of how they're manifesting or showing up in our lives. Figure out how to interrupt them and then replace it with something new. If something in this episode rang true, that matters. Awareness is powerful, but interruption is what creates change. So remember, you're not stuck. There's nothing wrong with you. You're patterned. If you're ready to interrupt that pattern, then book a way out session. We'll identify it clearly, interrupt it directly, and build a new response for you. The link is in the show notes. And if this episode helped you see something differently, send it to somebody who needs it. That's how we grow. I also love to give a shout out to listeners who leave reviews and share an episode, because I love recognizing the people who are actually doing the work. I will see you in the next episode.